Brothers were first, but none of us fly on Wright Brothers Airlines anymore. If you don't continue to innovate, you're not going to be around, and so we'll continue to be at the forefront of building Hyperloop.
Back in 2013, Elon had an idea. I think the difference now in 2021 is some brilliant engineers have spent real time grinding out the details. And I thoroughly expect the next 3 to 5 years to be decisive.
Everyone has viewed the consumer as this beast that's just always going to be there for you. And I think the challenge is right now that we've come to the end of the savings boom, right? We're starting to really dip into that. And the sentiment is awful. And generally speaking, consumers have been able to spend through poor sentiment, but I think we're at a different place right now where they're really starting to feel the sting of gas prices. There's no hope in sight. And we're starting to hear more and more about companies and layoffs. And so the minute you start hearing about companies and layoffs, that ripples through the rest of the economy with other businesses deciding to hold back on hiring new people, actually decide to trim some of the people that they already have. And I think that that's going to really impact the health of the consumer going forward. And that's just central to the rest of the U.S. economy.
Julie, market's been getting ahead of some of that. Retail's been absolutely hammered. But I'm reading your notes and you say avoid most retail stocks at any cost. How much worse do you think this gets for some of these big names?
I absolutely think it can get much, much worse in the retail sector, because if you think about if you think about back to school and holiday, they were ordering all of that inventory before the war in Ukraine. And so that means that they had also missed out on a whole bunch of sales because they didn't have the inventory. So when they finally get access to the inventory is exactly when I think consumer demand is really going to drop off a cliff. So I would avoid retailers under any circumstances other than maybe the off-price, who actually benefits from excess inventory. And, Americans love a good deal, so they typically tend to do better in a decline.
Futures down about 0.1% on the S&P, 24 minutes away from the opening bound. A little bit later this morning, we get some economic data in the United States of America. Then Mike McKee is on to the Fed minutes. He's down in D.C. to break that down for you. Mike, what's on the agenda for you?
Well, we'll watch the ISM numbers, and we're not really anticipating a huge drop. The service sector hanging in there. But if it did, that would move the markets. Now, you take a look at where the markets are, and I have to caution everybody, the markets are not the Fed. We get the minutes this afternoon, but that's from June 15th. And there's a big difference between where the markets were then and where the Fed was then. Take a look at the blue line there. That's where the markets were. They thought the Fed was behind the curve on June 15th. Now look at the white line. They think the Fed is still behind the curve, but in the other direction, that the economy is slowing so quickly. The Fed hasn't made any statements about the forecast since June 15th. So what we're going to get out of the minutes is probably old and not all that helpful. I think Jim Caron made a good point, though, about the Fed and credibility, because an awful lot of Fed officials have come out and said 75 is their base case for the end of July. So at this point, even whatever the minutes say, you're probably going to walk away from the minutes today with that still being the base case. Now, if the economy continues to show bad data, we may see the Fed slow down, maybe do 50. If we get a big high CPI number this month, 75 stays on the table. So what do you look for today in the minutes? Well, the supply-demand balance. Are they going to tell us anything about what they thought about when those two will get back together? Inflation dynamics, have they changed? Consumer and CEO confidence and spending. How related are they? People are still spending, even though confidence is down. And then, of course, a whole host of global issues. And I didn't even put on there COVID, which now seems to be back in Shanghai. So the question is, for the Fed, what's it going to look like on July 27th, not what it looked like on June 15th?
Where will the dollar be when they meet at the end of this month as well? Mike McKee, thank you. Looking to Europe, euro dollar 101.90. Numbers we haven't seen since 2000. and 2. That's the FX market. We need to talk about the bond market as well. Looking at a 2-year at about 278, 279, a 10-year at 277, some curve inversion. And to Mike's point on these minutes, think about the context for them. Just a couple of days before that Fed meeting, we were looking for a 50 basis point hike. Then we got a strong steer from some reporting that we'd get 75 basis points. And to what extent do these minutes today capture that shift from this Federal Reserve? Jim, we need to capture this shift in this bond market. Yields, a break of 280, staring at a break of 275 on a 10-year. And my go-to question, Jim, at the moment is whether we've seen the high for the year on a 10-year, have we?
I would have to say that we have. I think the markets right now are surrendering to the fact that we're likely to have a hard landing or a recession. And it seems to have happened all at once. As Mike was pointing out, the minutes in terms of what the Fed will be discussing is very, very old news at this point. So what I think is taking place is that the market has readjusted their expectations quite significantly. I mean, look, the Fed is telling us that they want to go to 3.8% by sometime in early 2023. The two-year yield is over 100 basis points below that level right now. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever unless one of two things. One, the market just doesn't believe that the Fed is actually going to be able to hike rates in the way that they're saying that they will, or something's going to happen along the way, and essentially we could have a recession and a slowdown, and that's what the markets are starting to price. At this point, I think, we do have to take the Fed very seriously about hiking rates. I don't think that they're willing to pull any punches at this point. And one of the things that they're trying to control is wage inflation. And wage inflation is going to be very, very key for them. So some of the softening in the labor market is not necessarily hurtful to their cause at this point, as long as it brings down wage inflation.
So, Jim, what we've got to think about is what kind of data pushes this Fed to back off, and how long do you have to wait to get that data? And if we're thinking about labor market data, then surely we're thinking about the barn door data. It's too late. The horse is gone. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. So that's why I think they're going to be on a steady path to hiking rates for the rest of this year, because essentially the labor market is coming from a very, very strong place at this point. I mean, look, even in the Fed's forecast, what they're saying is that they could have a soft landing and only have the unemployment rate go to 4.1%, which is only 4%, which is only about which is really, really close to their neutral rate, which is, to me, this is preposterous. I think the Fed really needs to actually do some damage to the labor market. Not that I'm advocating for that, but if they want to get wage inflation lower, they probably have to soften the economy enough such that there's more supply of labor coming in, and that will effectively bring down that wage inflation, which hopefully then transmits to lower inflation, just broadly speaking, across the CPI indices.
And this goes back to Julie's point. The consumer could get hit. Julie, stay away from the retailer. Right. So, Julie, let me get to the equity market just briefly with you again. The NASDAQ. When does the NASDAQ get interesting for you?
I think, generally speaking, we prefer the tech sector because there are a lot of very high quality businesses in there. But, not all tech stocks are the same. And so I think you still have to be very, very choosy. These long duration businesses that have no earnings are still not interesting, and they're probably not going to be interesting for a good long time. The good news is that they are hopefully learning from this, taking their medicine and figuring out how to be more profitable. I think the biggest problem with these unprofitable businesses is that they are run by typically pretty young people who haven't been in a managerial position in a recession, and they've only been able to run their businesses with incredible access to cheap capital. So my concern is they don't actually really know how to run a business under tighter circumstances. So we like software businesses that have only exposure to business rather than the consumer, and ones that are already profitable with recurring revenue.
Julie, can I take that a step further? Do you think investors haven't got the experience with these names to understand how exposed they are to the cycle as well?
I think, I don't know if it's experience. I just think, historically investors have a pretty short memory. And for them, it's a question of recognizing, recessions are a normal part of how things work. I feel like I'm having discussions like breaking up with someone where it's like, look, it's run its course. This bull market has been so long, and it's a natural part of bull markets to have pullbacks. For long-term investors, it's just an opportunity to find good names at a better price. But yeah, I think, the panic that we're seeing is a reflection of the investor psychology of, oh my God, I don't know what's happening.
Julie Bill, sticking with us alongside Jim Kerrin. Equities unchanged on the S&P, about 17 minutes away from the opening bout. Let's get you some movers. We can do that with Abby. Morning, Abby.
Good morning, John. And below that relatively benign surface for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, we do have some bigger movers, starting out with the shares of Tesla down at this point, although well off the lows, down about 0.7%. This, of course, after the company did miss on the delivery estimate of vehicles for the second quarter. However, Tesla over the last 2 days had been up about 5%. So investors may be reassessing. Coinbase down 1.8%. Bitcoin unable to get out of its own way, right around $20,000 per Bitcoin. Of course, one piece of this, Core Scientific, a miner, dumped most of its holdings. DoorDash down 8.3%. Uber is also lower. This is Amazon is offering free Grubhub membership for 1 year to Prime members. So DoorDash and Uber really getting hurt on that. And then finally, Altria up 1.5%. The FDA has temporarily suspended the Juul ban, and Altria, of course, owns 35% of Juul. So investors seeing that as a bit of a reprieve this morning, John.
Abby, thank you. Coming up, demand concerns beginning to grip commodity markets.
The demand simply isn't there as people had thought. I expect that we'll be seeing further downward revisions in demand.
That conversation up next.
When you think of cutting-edge technology at sea, you might be thinking of stuff like this. But there's an incoming revolution on the high seas that isn't quite as sexy, but could be significantly more impactful.
Container shipping is the key component of global trade. About 80 or 90% of all the world's goods are transported at sea at some point.
But there's a significant unseen cost to the modern era of global commerce.
About 3% of all the world's CO2 emissions come from shipping.
3% may not sound like a lot, but that's roughly comparable to the entire CO2 output of Germany. Since reducing trade isn't a likely option, what about a technological improvement to help reduce the emissions from these well-stocked maritime behemoths?
A market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
We're thinking in our base case that oil is going to go down to 85. And that's looking at it purely on a supply-demand basis. There's no evidence that we're going to see this summer surge in driving and summer surge in demand. The price is too high. The demand simply isn't there as people had thought. I expect that we'll be seeing further downward revisions in demand.
Ed Morse of Citi getting us all to think about what's happening with this commodity market as briefly we breach 100 and get back down to 99 on WTI in the last 24 hours or so. Brent crude not too far behind. Global commodities inching closer to bear market territory amid demand concerns now. The reversal coming just 1 month after setting record prices. Julian Lee joins us now from Bloomberg. Julian, I just want to start with the work of Ed Morse and this quote here. His base case obviously is in the 80s, but he talked about this recession scenario. And he went on to say we would see crude prices falling to 65 by year end, potentially 45 by end of 23, absent intervention by OPEC Plus and a decline in short cycle oil investment. Now, Julian, as you know, that's not the consensus trade or the consensus view. Your take on it?
I think this requires a really big hit to demand. I mean, we're looking back at what we saw in 2008 when we had prices up at 150 and within 6 months of that, they were down at $30 to $40 a barrel, and OPEC at that time was instituting massive output cuts. People aren't quite seeing that at the moment, but I do think that the only way that we can balance this market at the moment is through demand destruction, and this period of oil prices above $100 a barrel, with supply clearly lagging behind demand, massive amounts of oil being taken out of strategic storage. There isn't much more supply to come from anywhere, so we need the demand destruction. The big question is this going to be a full-blown recession, and are we going to get the huge drop in demand like we saw in 2008, 2009?
Julian, given the volatility in spot and commodity prices more broadly, how do you think the Saudis would respond to any requests from this administration to pump more crude?
Well, I think that the Saudis have taken a cautious line all the way through the run-up in their production over the last 12 months. They've added oil back drip by drip. They haven't even themselves kept pace with the targets that they've adopted for themselves. They are very concerned, I think, about weakness ahead, and what's happened in the last 24 hours is going to add to those concerns, certainly. They're not helped, I think, by the fact that OPEC's own forecasts assume that the group will pump at its target level. But already in May, it was over 2.5 million barrels a day below that. And that, I think, skews their view of the future. They see it perhaps more bleakly than many other people do. And it does still seem that although we've had this big sell-off in paper markets, the physical market is still strong. There is still more demand than there is supply. That may be changing. We're starting to see the first signs of demand weakness. Yep. But I think OPEC and Saudi Arabia is going to be very, very cautious.
What a move we saw yesterday. Julian Lee, thank you, sir. Down 8% yesterday, down about 1% today. 98 handle on WTI now. Big sell-off in energy equities as well. BlackRock's White Lee had this to say: they now appear priced for some retrenchment of energy prices, and we could see rising revenues and earnings amid the race to replace Russian supply. So, Julie, Bill, to you. Can energy equities do well in a world that you're looking to hit a consumer pretty hard?
Yeah, I think there is the opportunity for them to do okay. I think the biggest challenge in being any kind of commodities or energy investor is you're really not in charge of your destiny the way that you would be with another type of business. So I think longer term, energy probably doesn't have quite the level of strength that it does right now, simply because we have this external force and the conflict in Ukraine. When it's floating on the basis of its own fundamentals, I don't think the pricing is quite where it is right now. But how are we going to reduce or at least exchange some of the supply in Europe? That's really the big question, because all of that is long cycle infrastructure rebuilding. So I think in the near term, for sure, you can understand why there's support for oil, even if there is demand destruction, right? Because demand destruction is going to be on the order of high single digits at most, right? But I think the biggest question is this change in supply.
Jim, Judy mentioned Europe a few times there. We've got to go to it. Euro dollar, a break of 102. 101.88. You've got a big bid into the bond market. Steve Major of HSBC out earlier this morning with the team basically saying if we get a rate hiking cycle from this ECB, it's going to be shorter, shallower, it will end year end. Jim, your thoughts on what's taking place in Europe and what do we need to brace for?
So I think there are three things. The first is that the European economy is weakening. The second is that there are these fragmentation risks that are being discussed that are out there, and that certainly lowers confidence. And those points 1 and 2 then lead to point 3, which is that therefore the ECB probably can't hike rates as much as they would like to have. Then if we think of it that way, then the interest rate differentials between Europe and the U.S. would suggest that if Europe can't hike interest rates, then the euro really can't get any stronger. But if the Fed's willing to hike interest rates and the dollar will get stronger, then essentially that could bring the euro below the buck. And I think that that's in the process of what's taking place right now. But the euro's already fallen a lot. So I think a lot of this is already in the price. But there are some surprises that we could still have.
Sub-parity cool potentially. You're not alone. Jordan Rochester over at Nomura thinking about the same dynamic. Jim, awesome to catch up. Jim Curran, Julie Beal, fantastic as always. Julie, thank you. Euro dollar 101.91. Kit Jukes earlier this morning saying the euro supportive power of rate hikes is eroded by the fact that the bond market isn't trusted to stand on its own 2 feet, alluding to the problems they have with Italian yields. Those problems dying down because of what they're about to do with some kind of anti-fragmentation tool. The euro loses out. Kit says it remains effectively unbuyable this summer. Kit's view, Kit Jukes over at SocGen, 101.91 on euro dollar. Up next, the morning calls and a ton of water over my desk that I've just knocked over. Credit Suisse joining us too. 4,900 was the call, 4,300 is the call now. Jonathan Golub at the opening bell.
It all tells me that we're in a slowing economy, but nothing that looks recessionary, and that the earnings hold up fine.
John, you came very close to saying, or rather than listening to you, but I'll let it slide. I just want to come up with some counterpoints, John, just quickly. You mentioned the ISM. It is above 50, but the new orders component, as you know, dropped below 50. A lot of people would view that as a leading indicator for some pain still ahead. And forgive me for cherry picking, but I will anyway, and that provides a little bit of pushback for you if you want it. But for some of these companies, they haven't been pre-announcing. I can only really think of one major one, and that's been Microsoft off the back of this strong dollar. I imagine others are going to have to follow this earnings season. But when it comes to the retailers, John, they haven't been able to forecast any of this. In fact, they come out and downgrade on earnings day, the outlook, and then a month later, some of them have had to revise guidance all over again. And John, that makes people nervous. And what you see in the price off the back of that is massive gaps lower in the equity. Clearly not a lot of this is priced at all in that regard. What's the counterpoint to that, John?
Well, so let's take a look at last earnings season, the first quarter. We had a 6.7% beat during earnings season, which was above normal. But if you look at weakness, there really was no. So let's just kind of dig into first quarter a little bit, because it's the best preview we have. The revenues on the S&P were up 14%. Earnings were up 12%, which means you got some negative margin issues, but there was no real single underlying trend. You had a number of areas like energy and materials, which were, gangbusters. And then you had a couple of areas, like you mentioned, consumer discretionary, which was just terrible. And what's somewhat concerning about the consumer discretionary sector for me is that the demand, consumer spending, is weaker in the second quarter than the first quarter, and yet the first quarter had really poor earnings for consumer stocks. So I think that you very well could see in the second quarter continued weakness across consumer sectors, but it doesn't mean you're going to see it everywhere. I'll tell you another area of weakness, which is that the big cap tech did really poorly. But what is interesting is if you look to and you mentioned this a second ago, the second half of the year is expected to be better. And the big driver of that is actually a rebound in financials in the second half of the year.
John, I want to fit this in, and it's really a question about your process, and it's really not a criticism. You've come in from 4,900 down to 43. It's been a really tough year so far in the S&P. We're down about 20% as things stand at the moment. Is there a point on the calendar where you'd be able to acknowledge, I've been wrong, this is a dead year, this is not going to be the rebound that I've been looking for? Could you tell me how you would understand, as you interpret the data, when and how you might be wrong here?
Well, sure. Listen, I'll tell you right now where I've been right and wrong. So the earnings numbers, when we put out our earnings estimates, they were way out of the pack in terms of being very strong. And the argument was that nominal GDP, higher inflation, and strong growth would ultimately drive really strong profits. Those numbers look like they're very, very much on track with trend. So that's really been dead on. Our sector calls, we took down technology from overweight at the beginning of the year. That was a good call. We went underweight financials this year, which proved to be a really good call. What we got wrong, the interest rate jumped way more than we had anticipated, and the valuations got just demolished. And I think the fact that we lowered our numbers is acknowledging, listen, we want the Fed, or the Fed talks about being data dependent. And as strategists, we have to be data dependent as well. And when you have a meaningful increase in your discount rate, you have no choice but to adjust your numbers and basically say, this part I got right, this part I got wrong. But that doesn't mean we're going into recessional because stock prices haven't performed. And that's really where I remain somewhat constructive.
Still constructive. John, I appreciate the honesty, the transparency, just working through your process as we work through this year. Jonathan Golub there of Credit Suisse. It's been a tough year for the bulls, getting pushed back right now on the Bloomberg. What some bulls might be missing, here's one take for you, is that Energy Estimates has revised up and offset weakness elsewhere. Once energy rolls over, put a fork in it. I think that's the less constructive view at the moment. Coming up, a host of US economic data on deck this week.
I expect a really horrible summer in terms of the data deteriorating far faster than people expect. Until the Fed really switches and gets off fighting inflation at all costs, I think they're missing all these little hints that there's problems in the economy.
We've got some PMIs to talk about, and they deliver a bit of an upside surprise. That conversation up next.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists.
Good morning, John. Well, the whipsaw view of whether we're not or whether we are in recession gets another whip today. The S&P Global PMI Index for Services rises instead of falls in the month of June. 52.3 was 51.2 last time, and the composite index for them is 52.3, and that was 51.2 the last time. So we see the S&P ISMs or PMIs rising, sets the stage for the ISM Services Index at the top of the hour.
Mike McKee, thank you. Looking ahead to that data at the top of the hour. Mike McKee's going to break that down for you. Ashok Bhatia joins us now, Neuberger Berman, Deputy CIO of Fixed Income. Ashok, always great to catch up with you, sir. Given the data that's coming in, can you say with conviction, confidence that we may have already seen a peak on a 10-year yield or not?
Yeah, we think it's a decent chance we've seen the peak, and the peak in Fed hiking expectations, and that we'll spend a bunch of time circling around a 3% 10-year note. And I think the biggest issue and the thing the bond market is wrestling with is the Fed has been, and I think Jonathan Golub was talking about this, the market or the Fed is really focused on the current data and the current inflation, and if and how the Fed will move to start to look at a lot of market indicators like crude oil and inflation break-evens and slow down the path of hiking. And the bond market is starting to price that and wrestle with that. And that's been the key driver for why, we've had this, 70 basis point fall in rates from the peak just a few weeks ago.
It's been a massive move. Ashok, I just wonder from your perspective, whether a bet on treasuries, and you've captured that move lower in yields, I know, is that a bet against the Fed?
I think it's a bet that the soft landing thesis, which is obviously very out of favor here right now, is still it's a higher probability than the market expects. Our base case at Neuberger is still that the U.S. economy can have something that avoids a recession or any sort of kind of very significant slowdown, different for other regions of the world. But, a lot of the things that are going on now, it's pretty interesting that inflation break-evens they're closer to 2% than they are 3%. We've obviously seen the move lower in energy prices and gasoline prices. And to the extent we see a little bit weaker data and start to see the fall in inflation, that a fall in inflation is pretty much guaranteed in the second half. The debate is about the speed of it and where it ends up. But those things come together, and depending on how the Fed reacts to it, it can allow the Fed to be a little slower and bring some more stability in all these financial markets.
Ashok, I wonder what that actually tells us, though. Is that a market that's basically saying this Fed has already done the damage. It only needs to go so far to cause even more damage, and break-evens are already rolling over. Because if I throw in credit, it's a less constructive view, isn't it? Credit spreads have been breaking out. They've not been coming in. We're at 580. So you've walked me through where you are on treasuries. Can you walk me through where you are on credit, given how we're priced at the moment and given the direction of travel?
Yeah, I think for credit, our view is that, the next thing, and we'll see this in the second half, is better performance from credit markets. And, the need for credit markets need rate stability. They don't necessarily need, significantly lower rates from here, given where, high yield index is at, just under 9% in yield, investment grade credit, 4.5%. So credit markets first need some stability in interest rates, and that will be the big driver. And then second is, I think, hearing a little bit more or getting a little bit more confidence in the these spread levels. We continue to examine expected rates, and our expectation is even in a recession, credit is going to hold up from a fundamental perspective better than the market seems to think. So we think the next phase of this for the bond market will be stability and tighter credit spreads.
That's the hope. And that's the hope that I can say the equity investors have as well. Ashok, fantastic to catch up with you. Bit of a technical issue there just at the end. My apologies for that. Ashok Bhatia there of Neuberger Berman. That is the second guest this hour who thinks we may have already seen a peak in the 10-year yield. That peak, of course, very close to 350 back in June. Right now, your 10-year, bringing it up on the Bloomberg for you. Your yield is 282. Yield just bouncing back a little bit off the back of that better than expected PMI and ahead of an ISM at about 7 minutes time. The ISM services read just around the corner. Your trading diary is as well. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
What's happening on Wall Street?
It's the basic law of economics.
It validated what the market was already pricing.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
It's a challenging dynamic.
We could continue to see that kind of strength.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This year, this is nothing, isn't it? We're negative about 0.2% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq 100 down about 0.1%. Going into some really important economic data over the next 48 hours or so, into claims tomorrow, then onto payrolls on Friday. That's the price action. Here is your trading diary. At the top of the hour, the ISM services and JOLTS job openings coming up. Guy Johnson and the team will break that down. The latest Fed minutes due out at 2 Eastern time. President Biden speaking from Ohio this afternoon. We'll get another round of initial jobless claims Thursday morning, coming up tomorrow. Finally on Friday, it's the main event. It's the payrolls report, and the team just telling me the median estimate in our survey so far, 265,000 for that number, 8:30 Friday morning. Tom Keene and I together in DC tomorrow. Looking forward to that. This was the countdown to the open. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. And the place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
Pepsi's Number Fever campaign in the Philippines has probably gone down in history as one of the biggest marketing disasters in history, mainly because of a human error that led Pepsi to print more winning caps than they planned. The resulting chaos caused riots, civil unrest, and even deaths. Reporting this story took over a year, and it resulted in me flying to Manila in the Philippines to meet unlucky winners and to find out exactly what happened back then in the 1990s. My name is Jeff Maish. I'm a journalist based in Los Angeles. I wrote the story for Bloomberg Businessweek about Pepsi's Number Fever campaign. The Philippines is a really interesting country. It's made up of thousands of islands, and it's also a country that's very heavily influenced by America. American culture is everywhere you look in the Philippines. They're obsessed with Frank Sinatra music, for example. They love all things America, and that extends to their love for soft drinks, Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola. In the 1990s, it was everywhere. Pepsi and Coca-Cola were embroiled in what is now known as the Cola Wars. It was a fierce battle for market dominance. Number Fever was already a really popular promotion. It had been rolled out in America to great success. And so Pepsi decided to roll it out internationally, particularly in Asia. They thought it was the answer to their problems. They thought it could finally help them beat their biggest competitor.
I won! Look for the winning number in sari stores every day, also on TV, radio, and newspapers. You could be a millionaire.
$1 million pesos, or $68,000, doesn't sound like a lot now, but in 1992, that was a phenomenal amount of money. You've got to remember that in the Philippines at the time, the average monthly income was about $100, so $1 million pesos was wealth beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. Number Fever caught fire in the Philippines. Kids were saving up their pocket money to buy a bottle of Pepsi. Parents were squirreling away all of the bottle caps in bags. You would walk down the street and people were going through trash trying to find discarded bottle caps. It was a national phenomenon. Pepsi boasted that half the population of the Philippines was playing it. Number Fever boosted Pepsi's sales. every month from $10 million to $14 million. It had a huge impact on Pepsi's bottom line. Number fever quickly became number hysteria. Maids were being jailed for stealing their employers' winning bottle caps. There was even some murders over winning bottle caps. People were fighting in the streets over these caps. There were signs that there were going to be problems with number fever very early. Pepsi had rolled out the competition in Chile, and a garbled fax had caused some kind of problem with the winning number. They'd announced the wrong one in Chile, causing riots. There were signs that there could be big problems ahead if they didn't keep their eye on the ball. So in 1992, Pepsi decided to extend the campaign in the Philippines, and they announced that the competition would go on for a few more weeks. One night, on the television news, they announced the latest winning number, 349. The problem was, 349 had already been allocated as a non-winning number in earlier campaigns. So there were literally hundreds of thousands of bottle caps with 349 just floating around the Philippines. Hundreds of thousands of people all across the Philippines, thousands of islands, were finding winning bottle caps. 349, 349. Some people had 10 lucky 349 bottle caps. People were dancing in the streets, celebrating. They thought their problems were over. They were millionaires. It's still not certain exactly how many winners there were of lucky 349 bottle caps, but we know that Pepsi printed over 600,000 of them. Pepsi realized very early that there was a problem. Hundreds of people started arriving at their bottling plants with their lucky bottle caps. They realized something was seriously wrong. Pepsi tried to solve the problem by offering a small token donation to anyone that brought a lucky bottle cap to their bottling plant. But it wasn't enough. People didn't want just a handful of pesos. People wanted their million peso prize. Within a year, violent protests and riots outside Pepsi factories would leave dozens injured and 5 people dead. At one Pepsi factory in the Philippines, a grenade was thrown through the window. It killed 3 Pepsi employees. Anacita Rosario was a school teacher living near Manila in the Philippines. She was one of the tragic victims of this whole thing. She was walking to a nearby store to buy some rice one day when a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a Pepsi truck in a violent protest. It bounced under the truck and exploded. It killed her and an innocent bystander who was just a child and injured many others. When I was in the Philippines, I tracked down Anacita's daughter, Cindy, and her husband, Raul. It was clear to me that they were still very upset by the whole thing. You know, a family had been ripped apart by this competition. And Raul told me that he'd never remarried. He'd told me that he'd gone to meet Pepsi executives after his wife was killed. And he was angry. He said to them, you know, this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for number fever. The biggest revelation from my reporting was rumors that Pepsi was somehow involved in bombing their own trucks. I found a newspaper report with a headline that said, "Pepsi goons bomb their own trucks." And when I visited the MBI, the police department in the Philippines, they presented me with documents and interviews with people who claimed that Pepsi had paid them to cause riots and to cause trouble outside their plants in order to destabilize the situation and to frame the owners of the coalitions that were fighting them to try and curry favor. I just thought that was so shocking, and of course Pepsi denied it, but how bizarre that a company would be accused of bombing their own trucks. The contest had sparked so much anger in the Philippines because it landed at just this really weird time in the Philippines' history. It was during a crazy election that was racked with allegations of fraud. The Philippines was in a kind of love-hate relationship with America. They loved, obviously, the American aid and finances that was pouring into the country, but at the same time they yearned for independence. They wanted to be their own country. Vicente Del Fierro was a local preacher living in Manila, and he hated the number fever campaign. Del Fierro thought Pepsi's number fever campaign was just one of the many ways that America was asserting its dominance over a third world country. He hated seeing his fellow countrymen get ripped off, in his eyes, by this huge multinational American company. He wanted justice. Del Fierro rounded up over 800 winners of 349 bottle caps, and he got them all together to sue Pepsi for over $400 million to be divided between those holders of lucky bottle caps. Del Fierro took money from some of the people who could afford it. They paid him 500 pesos to help with legal fees, but for people who couldn't afford the money, he would just represent them pro bono.
The alliance is to build up pressure on Pepsi. And so you see people marching in the streets. So we had mounted our own campaign, even in the U.S.
He flew to America and he hired two consumer lawyers here in America to take on Pepsi. He had a meeting at Pepsi's headquarters to try and resolve the problem, but he said he wanted to take it all the way to the highest courts in America. When those cases were heard in America, those courts decided that this was a problem that should be heard in the Philippines, not in America. Back in the Philippines, Del Fierro continued his case in the Filipino courts. At one stage, there were arrest warrants handed out for 9 Pepsi-Cola executives, which he saw as a big victory. We don't know if those arrest warrants were ever upheld, but it made newspaper headlines across the country. Pepsi did not take kindly to Del Fierro's campaign. They tried everything to shut him down. They sued him for libel.
My father had to attend 3.
Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to do a bit of a rant video. Hopefully I managed to keep it kind of short, but basically addressing a comment that I've seen sort of under my videos every so often, which is that motherboard vendors lying about phase counts is a new thing. And I guess maybe if you consider the year 2008 to be relatively recent, then sure, motherboard vendors lying about phase counts is in fact new. However, in 2008, I didn't even know what a motherboard is. And so to me, this has been happening for ages. Motherboard manufacturers have been lying about phase counts. Then I came along, got really annoyed by it. I've been trying to get them to stop doing it, and failing to some extent with some of them. But anyway, so today we're going to take a quick look at the VRM of the Gigabyte GA-EX58 Extreme motherboard, which at Gigabyte back in the day advertised as a 12+2 phase. This motherboard, again, is from 2008. So in 2008, we already had fake phase counts. And all you really need to see in order to know that this motherboard can't be a 12-phase V-core, the rest of it is fine. The +2+2 part, that's fine. It has that. But the 12-phase V-core, I mean, all you need to look at is the back of the board and just sort of, you know, if you know anything about how a buck converter works, you can look at this right here and you'll notice that, wait a minute, aren't these two inductors connected to the same switch node? So how are you supposed to switch the current through these two inductors independently? Because they're connected to, like, they're in parallel on the input side. Of course, on the, like, all of the inductors output into the same power plane, so the output of all the inductors is in parallel. Like, all your phases ultimately, you know, end up, like, your phases ultimately all run in parallel, as in, they have 12 volts coming in from the same 12-volt source, and they output V-core to the same V-core power plane. But the whole separation between the phases, like, this right here is your separation between the phases, right? Like, this is a phase, this is a phase, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
In my previous electronic basics video, I showed you that bipolar junction transistors can easily be used as a switch in order to turn on and off your load slowly or even rapidly if you want to, for example, dim the brightness of your favorite LED efficiently. But as soon as I tried to control a bigger load, the transistor started to heat up quite a bit, which is mainly due to the energy loss of the collector-emitter path. This means our circuit's efficiency can still be improved, and for that there luckily exists another popular and more suitable transistor type, the so-called MOSFETs. By creating a similar circuit which can basically do the same as before, the MOSFET only has an energy loss of 0.6 watts across its equivalent collector-emitter path, and thus the overall efficiency of the circuit up to 97%. Not bad. So in this video I will show you at first how easy it is to control such a MOSFET with an Arduino, and then how difficult it can actually get when you want to use them in more demanding applications. Let's get started. There exist two types of MOSFETs, N-channel ones and P-channel ones, but more commonly used are N-channel types, like this IRLZ44N, which has 3 pins called gate, drain and source, which is the equivalent to the base, collector and emitter of a BJT. But instead of utilizing current that flows through the base of a BJT in order to switch on the loads, the MOSFET only requires a high enough voltage at the gate. No current. This FET only flows through the emitter, gate, drain and source, which is the equivalent to the base, collector and emitter of a BJT. But instead of utilizing current that flows through the base of a BJT in order to switch on the loads, the MOSFET only requires a high enough voltage at the gate. No current. This voltage needs to be higher than the threshold voltage mentioned in the datasheets, but lower than the maximum rated gate to source voltage. So with the 5 volt of the Arduino, we should easily be able to control around 5 amps of current, while maintaining the lowest possible drain to source voltage. The region we use here in the output characteristic curves is called the linear region, in which the resistance of the drain to source path is almost constant. But before going too much into the theory, let's build up the circuit by connecting the source directly to ground, the cathode of my LED to the drain and the anode to the supply voltage. But one problem that was immediately noticeable was that even electrostatic voltages of my body can turn on the loads, even big ones like this light bulb. So it is always a good idea to place a 10 kilo ohm pull down resistor between gate and source in order to prevent that. And after directly connecting the PWM signal of the Arduino to the gate, the circuit was complete and does work the way it is supposed to. So let's inspect the voltages on the oscilloscope. While the Arduino voltage goes high, the drain to source voltage goes low, and the other way around. Perfect. And by adding a potential Nowadays, the field of power electronics is ruled by so-called MOSFETs, also known as metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors. The reasons are easy to understand. They only require a certain threshold voltage at their gate in order to switch high voltages and currents with high frequencies and low power losses. That makes them the perfect component for building efficient switch mode power supplies, motor speed controllers, or just to turn on and off a couple of LEDs really fast.
How does your computer put on such a fantastic light show with all those LEDs? How do the lights fade and change colors? Is there a legion of pixies with an amazing array of dimmer switches coordinated precisely so that your friends are impressed with your RGB lighting? Well, the reality is a bit less fantastical, but with the recent unionization of pixies, we have the much more practical pulse width modulation. So what is pulse width modulation? PWM varies the perceived power going to an electronic device by very quickly turning the power on and off. The perceived output is changed by varying the duty cycle. Now, the duty cycle isn't the time it takes your dog to spin around before going about its business, but instead how long the signal is turned on versus turned off. This means with the duty cycle of 50%, the signal is turned on half the time and off the other half, whereas a duty cycle of 100% means the signal is always on. An important part of the duty cycle is the switching frequency, or how fast the signal is turned on and off. For instance, turning an LED on for a second and then off for a second would be a duty cycle of 50%, but the LED won't be half as bright, it'll just be annoying. To make the LED appear dimmer, the on-off switching has to be faster than the flicker fusion rate, or how quickly a light has to turn on and off to be perceived by the brain as being continuously on. In humans, the flicker fusion rate is around 18 times per second. Typically, LEDs controlled by PWM will be switched on and off over 100 times per second, or 100 hertz. By using a duty cycle of 25% at 100 hertz, it means that the LED would be turned on and off 100 times per second, but the duration of each on cycle is only a quarter of the time, making the LED appear 25% as bright. And as you probably know, PWM is also useful for quiet and efficient PC cooling. Older fans controlled from the motherboard had very poor speed control, meaning that the fans would run much faster and louder than they actually needed to be at that point in time. PWM fans, however, allow for the motherboard to easily control the fan speed, giving low, quiet fan speeds when just browsing the web to gale force winds when you're playing Crysis. So can we dim a light or change a fan speed without using PWM? Well, older systems might use DC voltage control. This works by changing the resistance in a circuit. The more resistance, the less power transmitted to the fan or light. Since there is no switching, DC control has the advantage of smoother power delivery, but they often don't offer the same range of speeds that a PWM fan does. Not to mention that any power that isn't being used gets wasted as heat, which is why old dimmer switches use the same amount of power no matter how much light they made. It has been said that PWM monitors can cause eye strain from the constant flickering, although makers of DC-controlled monitors seem to pretty much be the only ones that are saying this, so trust them if you want. Beyond changing how much power is going to something, PWM can be used to transmit data between two devices, where pulses of different lengths represent the data being transferred. This is how your TV remote switches channels and how data is transmitted from cell towers to your phone. PWM is also used in some audio amplifiers, making them extremely efficient. The typical efficiency of a non-PWM amplifier is between 25% and 50%, while a PWM amp can reach efficiencies of 99%. The cool operation and high efficiency makes these amplifiers popular in car audio, so you can bump T-Swift all day without, turning your dash into a frying pan. TunnelBear VPN allows you to tunnel into 20 different countries, giving you
I am going to explain the difference between duty cycle, frequency, and pulse width. These terms are often used together. They're sometimes used interchangeably, and they're often confused, but they have different meanings, and I'm going to take a minute and explain that. Now, first, I wanted to just make sure that we understand the difference between a digital and analog signal, because all of these signals that we're going to be measuring are going to either be digital or analog. A digital signal is one that switches on and off or has finite increments. An analog signal is one that has infinite number of increments as it changes. So let's start with the analog signal. An analog signal could be a waveform of any kind where the voltage is varying or changing. It has an infinite number of different increments that it can change to. It's not just on or off or high or low, but it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 1.5 and 2.5 and 3 3/4. And those increments can even be split smaller and smaller, and it varies infinitely. A digital signal, on the other hand, is given a set number or a finite number of increments, typically on or off, or high or low. So if we have a 0 to 5 volt scale here, low may be near 0 volts, and high would be near 5. It looks like a square wave because it doesn't vary. There is no 1.5, it's either 0 or 5, and nothing in between. So often we have an analog signal that needs to be converted to a digital signal. Whenever we're using a computer or a data acquisition device, we're collecting analog voltage measurements that vary, and they've got to be turned into some sort of a digital signal that the computer can recognize and interpret. So the way that works is like this. If this is our analog signal that's coming in, it's a waveform that's varying like this, we would set up some kind of a rule or a threshold, and we might say if this is 0 volts down here at the bottom and this is 5 volts, so we're looking at a 5 volt scale, the threshold may be 2.5 volts right here in the middle. What happens is as this signal goes into the analog to digital converter, it monitors it, and as long as the voltage is below 2.5 volts, it's considered low. So it moves along here at a low voltage until it reaches this 2.5 volt point, and when it does, it immediately switches to high. And it stays high until it drops past the 2.5 volt level again, and that continues every time it crosses that 2.5 volt wave signals. Okay, so if we have some type of an electrical signal, and it doesn't matter whether it's analog or digital, but we'll just start out with a digital signal. We'll use digital because it's most universal. There are 3 different ways that we can measure this signal. I'm not talking about voltage, the voltage level or amplitude, right? That's obvious. We're always going to be able to measure that. But as far as its time, the time base, there are 3 ways we can measure it. One is in a percentage, and that's called duty cycle. We simply take one cycle, which is from here to here, and we ask ourselves what percentage of that cycle was this turned on for. And here it looks like roughly 50%, so we could say it was on for 50% of the time, and it was off for 50% of the time. And when it comes to duty cycle, we're simply talking about the on time. So this has a 50% duty cycle. I'll add a few more segments here. If I continue to go down here, I can see my cycles are all staying about the same width. This looks like maybe another 50%, or it's slightly wider. We could call this a 55% duty cycle, which would mean that it's off for 45% of the time. This one looks like it's close to 50 again, but over here we've got something that's much smaller. During this cycle, it looks like maybe it was on for only about 20% of the time, which means it was off for 80%, the 20% duty cycle at that point. So that's duty cycle. Now the other measurements are frequency and pulse width. Frequency takes these cycles that we just marked off and says, how many times did that happen per second? And that's measured in hertz, abbreviated as Hz. How many cycles per second? So if we look at this, we would, if this happened to be 1 second from here to here, we would say, well, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 cycles per second. If it happened that there were 100 of those in a second, we would say at 100 hertz, where the frequency was 100 hertz, 100 cycles per second. So frequency is measured in cycles per second, duty cycle is measured in percentage of on time, and finally pulse width is measured in actual time, usually in milliseconds. We're talking about a computer that's turning these things off and on, so it's usually quick.
Why does your computer need a power supply anyway? You've already got tons of power coming right out of the wall. Oh, it blew the fuse.
That's why. But why didn't this work? And what does a power supply actually do? To answer those questions, we'll be taking you through all the stages of your computer's power supply and how they work. Sponsored by Seasonic. From the wall, you get alternating current, or AC power, which historically has been cheaper to generate and efficiently transport over long distances, which is great, but not for a computer. Computers work by storing ones and zeros in logic gates, and for logic gates to function, a very stable input voltage is required. AC, which goes from positive to negative voltage many times a second, could be used, but it's kind of like how you could also build a car with square wheels. You shouldn't. So then, our wall AC power needs to be converted to direct current, or DC, which has a constant voltage. No problem. Let's talk about linear power supplies. From the wall, you're getting either 110 or 220 volt AC power. Since we're in North America, we'll be using 110 volt for our examples. Now, that is still a way higher voltage than what you want for your computer. So the first major stage is a transformer that takes us from 110 volt AC to 12 volt AC. Transformers are relatively simple. When AC current travels through a wire, it creates a magnetic field. This magnetic field can be made much stronger by wrapping the wire into a tight coil. And then if you place another coil right beside it, the changing magnetic field will start moving the electrons in the second wire. That voltage that you get on the second wire is then determined by the number of turns in each coil. So to take our 110 volt down to 11 volt, we could have 100 turns on the primary side and just 10 on the secondary. Once we're at a more manageable voltage, we're ready to turn that AC into DC using a rectifier. Rectifiers work on the basis that diodes only allow electricity to flow in one direction. So you chuck AC through it, and it spits out something a little bit like this. You just add a capacitor and bam, DC. Now, the formal name for this circuit right here is single diode rectifier, but more commonly in electrical engineering circles, you'll hear it referred to as CRAP. That's where something called a full bridge rectifier comes in. For a more detailed look at the full bridge rectifier, you can check out this classic from Electroboom, but we can get you through the basics. By using 4 diodes in this configuration, on the positive wave, electricity flows through diode 1 and 3 to complete the circuit, and then on the negative wave, it goes through diodes 2 and 4. That leads to much less waste. Then from here, you just chuck a capacitor on the output and boom, you're good to go. Linear power supplies are actually still used for many things, including musical instruments, thanks to their ability to deliver very clean power. But unfortunately, you wouldn't want to use one for your computer due to their 60+ turd efficient ability to deliver on the output and boom, you're good to go. Linear power supplies are actually still used for many things, including musical instruments, thanks to their ability to deliver very clean power. But unfortunately, you wouldn't want to use one for your computer due to their 60+ turd efficiency rating. And then there's also the fact that they only work for a single input frequency and voltage. So power supply manufacturers would have to make completely different models of the same power supply capacity for every different market. So wait a second, why did I just explain linear power supplies then?
Because someone had to give them the background that they need for this next part about what we actually use, switching mode power supplies. Let's take a journey through your PSUs, starting at where the AC enters and leaving, where the DC goes to your motherboard. Before we can even worry about converting from AC to DC, we need to do a bit of filtering. So these little blue boys in here, they are called Y capacitors, and the gray one right there, that's an X capacitor. These guys prevent your computer to do a bit of filtering. So these little blue boys in here, they are called Y capacitors, and the gray one right there, that's an X capacitor. These guys prevent your computer from sending electrical noise back into your house wiring, which could cause problems with other devices. Meanwhile, we also have to filter the incoming power, so your computer doesn't get all screwy when your roommate fires up the blender to make some margaritas. My favorite part of this EMI filtering stage is hidden in here. It's called a metal oxide vary resistor, or MOV, and it's cool because this changes its resistance based on the input voltage. So normally it's just chilling there acting as an open circuit, but when a voltage spike comes in, its resistance drops and that extra energy just gets chucked to the ground. Instead of, blowing up everything else. In cheap power supplies, the MOV might be omitted, and if it is, you should omit that power supply from your parts list. Once the signal is clean, we can turn our attention to power factor correction. As AC flows through inductors or capacitors, the voltage and current will get out of phase with each other, resulting in wasted energy. This bank of MOSFETs and big ol' inductor make sure that you get as much from your AC input as possible, at which point it's chucked through a rectifier right there, and out of that you get 300 to 400 volts of DC. Next, these big Chungus capacitors smooth out the voltage of the DC current flowing from the main bridge rectifier, and side note, I would strongly recommend not licking these. Now let's talk about the most surprising part. We've gone from AC, which comes from the wall, to DC, which your computer needs, and now we're going to go back to AC. And stay with me here because the payoff is huge. To do it, we run DC through our MOSFETs that are right there, giving us AC power, but in a square wave, which is fine, except that every time that a MOSFET gets turned on or off, you lose some efficiency. To almost entirely reduce these switching losses, a technique called soft switching is used. So in parallel to these MOSFETs is a capacitor and an inductor that will begin to resonate as the MOSFETs are switched. The resonator creates a sine wave, and by syncing up the MOSFET switching to when the sine wave is close to at zero, you can almost entirely eliminate the switching losses. I'm not even going to pretend how to understand the math behind how this works, but if you think you've got the stuff, here's a paper to enjoy as part of your PhD in electrical engineering. Long story short, we now have AC power again, but it's perfectly power factor corrected and at a much higher voltage and frequency compared to what's coming out of your wall. This allows the main transformer right here to be both much smaller and a lot more power efficient as it converts it into 12 volts AC, which is then fed into the rectifier right there, and you have 12 volts DC for your PC. For those of you paying very close attention, that was it. We finally came back around to how your computer uses a linear power supply, but not quite, like we talked about before, just with extra steps.
Hey, there it is! I knew we were gonna make it back here. Then we take that 12-volt DC and we add some hefty capacitors for filtering and to improve transient response. In layman's terms, this 3300 microfarad capacitor here is gonna do a lot to prevent a voltage drop if your RTX 3090 decides it suddenly needs 500 or 600 watts for a few milliseconds. Not everything in your PC uses 12 volt, however, so we also need these DC to DC buck converters to get us 3.3 and 5 volts, giving us everything we need to run a computer, except the ability to turn it on. See this other mini transformer over here? This little fellow takes our high voltage DC from before and turns it into 5 volt standby, which is always on, even when the computer is turned off, allowing it to power things like motherboard RGB and always on USB charging ports. Oh, right, and also it powers the power button so that you can fire up your machine and get on with important tasks, like visiting LTTstore.com, where we have great merchandise like these high-quality t-shirts, fantastic water bottles, and even...
But none of that really explained why good power supplies can cost anywhere from $100 to $500. Something you've probably heard talked about in community forums and even power supply marketing is component quality, with Japanese capacitors coming up a lot. But do they even make a difference? These days, probably not. But that doesn't mean they're a bad thing. Between 1999 and 2007, there was a capacitor plague, where capacitors made in Taiwan experienced a higher than expected failure rate due to issues with the raw materials used to manufacture them, while capacitors in Japan experienced no such problems. Since then, capacitors made in China and Taiwan have greatly increased in quality, and the vast majority of Japanese capacitors are just Japanese branded capacitors. They're actually manufactured in China. With that being said, there is still some value to Japanese capacitors because typically they are designed and tested to meet the quality requirements laid out by the Japanese companies overseeing their production. To figure out if any individual company is good though, Tom's Hardware created a capacitor tier list that you can reference when trying to figure out if a specific component is good or not. The overall capacitance of your power supply can be a double-edged sword though. One thing people often get wrong is automatically assuming high efficiency equals high quality, but unfortunately this isn't always true. An easy way to boost the efficiency of your power supply is to reduce the capacitance. You no longer have to worry about charging up those big old caps so you waste less power, but you could fire up a game and end up rendering nothing but a black screen.
And do we have hardware info? And that, my friends, is why you don't buy your power supply on AliExpress.com.
Evaluating how different power supply manufacturers have balanced efficiency and transient response is beyond the scope of this video, but we wanted you to know that filtering by 80+ rating and sorting by price isn't the way to go. Low capacitance can also be a problem for small form factor power supplies. There's simply less space to add capacitors. In general, this won't be a problem, but if you're building an SFF PC that is high powered, maybe consider over-speccing the power supply a bit just to be on the safe side. Also, to be on the safe side, never mix modular cables between two different power supplies, even if they look identical. There is a chance they are different, and if they are, it's magic smoke time. It's always bothered me why they aren't standardized though, and I was finally able to ask. Turns out the answer is pretty simple. Everyone developed modular power supplies around the same time, and the connectors were almost arbitrarily chosen by each company based on their current PCB layout and the connectors easily available from their suppliers. Maybe modular cables can get standardized if the specs change? And there is a good chance the spec for power supplies could change soon. The ATX standard has only gotten relatively small revisions since it was created by Intel way back in 1995. And there are some problems with this, like power supplies in 2020 needing to output 3.3 and 5 volts despite these voltages barely being used by modern hardware. But this could be changing soon. In June 2020, version 2.53 of the ATX standard was added, where the power supply would only be delivering 12 volts and the motherboard would be responsible for DC to DC conversion. As I showed in this video, this should result in significant real-world efficiency improvements, especially at idle. But the people we talked to wished Intel had gone even further and switched to 24 or 48 volts like you might find in industrial applications. Basically, higher voltage means less current at a given power, and less current means less heat generated and a higher efficiency. Which brings us to the final reason why buying a quality power supply is a good idea. Good old Mother Earth. As much as electronics makers try and put a positive spin on their environmental progress, Apple, Pretty much every component in your PC will offer up mediocre performance in a few years or be downright broken. High-quality power supplies, though, can last you through multiple upgrades. Seasonic, the sponsor of this video, has up to freaking 12-year warranties on some of their units. So at least that's one part that won't end up in a landfill anytime soon. So
Choosing a power supply is one of the toughest parts of building a new PC. Now, we recently covered choosing the right wattage power supply, but today is all about modular versus non-modular interfaces. First, a glossary. Non-modular means all of the cables are pre-attached and cannot be removed. Modular means at least some of the cables can be stashed away if they aren't needed, and fully modular means every single cable, even the ones a system cannot run without, can be taken off and put somewhere else if you want to. So we'll kick things off with non-modular power supplies. I guess there's not much to say. The power comes in from the wall, and the wires connect to other stuff in your system, so it turns on. If you have extra cables, you jam them into a corner somewhere and call it a day. Next up is the middle ground, a semi-modular power supply unit. Why would you want that? Well, most PC systems use only a fraction of the connectors that a high-performance power supply can support. A semi-modular power supply has the necessary connectors pre-attached and then lets you pick the other ones based on your individual needs and leave all the other stuff in the box. Right, but that didn't really answer my question, Linus. You literally just said I can just jam the extras in a corner of my case, so who cares? You're right, there's actually nothing wrong with that, but there are a couple of reasons you might not want to. Airflow and aesthetics. With fewer cables attached to your power supply, you can more
If you're wiring up your first power supply, you might be a bit intimidated by, well, all of this. And I get it, installing the PSU was one of the most confusing aspects of my first PC build as well. There are connectors that look virtually the same. There are some that are split in two. So in this video, we'll quickly and precisely run through what each cable does and where each should be connected. Stay with me.
Activating Windows is as simple as hopping on over to SCD Key's VIP site, where you can purchase an OEM Pro key for a little over $10 US. Use a secure payment method like PayPal, receive your key in a matter of seconds, and activate your OS here to remove that annoying watermark. Click the link below to get started and use my offer code GSL for a sweet discount.
So I understand this video will come across as a bit elementary, a bit basic for those who have built PCs before, but I've been putting more of these videos together lately because the PC gaming industry is growing at a very rapid rate, especially now. And when given the choice, one should almost always DIY, save money and perhaps learn a thing or two, and that's where these videos come in handy, especially for those beginners. Now, the power supply we'll be using for this demonstration today is a relatively cheap one. It's an EVGA 550 watt. It's called a 550N1, pretty basic name. It doesn't actually even have an 80+ efficiency, oddly enough. You have to really dig deep to find the minimum efficiency of this unit, which in the box, actually, it only says it on the box, nowhere else, not on the website, anywhere. It says it's above 75%, so all right. Nonetheless, many have been using power supplies like these without issue, and it's probably one that you'll at least consider in your first $500 or so PC build, unless you're going all out and your first PC build costs like $3 grand. Okay, probably don't want this. You'll also notice that this unit has all of its cables hardwired to the brick itself, thus classifying it as a non-modular power supply. In the case of modular units, you'll be able to pick and choose what you'd like connected, which could spare you from a bit of clutter when building your PC. And another thing, you don't need to connect every available cable here, right? If you don't need, 4 or 5 Molex connections or SATA connections, you can leave these unplugged. So just rule of thumb going into this. So you can either shove them into an empty spot of your case or leave them entirely disconnected from your unit if you have a modular supply. This also, by the way, applies to PCIe connectors and any other redundant cable. But let's focus on each cable type, what each does, and where each connects to your system, starting first with the largest connector, more than likely, the 20 pin, or you've probably heard it called the 24 pin. There's an extra 4 pins tacked on here. What does this do? Well, this cable is in charge of delivering power to your motherboard and its peripherals. The extra 4 pins you may see dangling next to the 20 pin head are there to provide additional power to your PCIe slots, which are these things here. This cable is vital in modern conventional computers and needs to be connected. The header will look something like this and is often found on the right side of most ATX motherboards. ITX and smaller boards may have this positioned elsewhere due to space limitations. They may even come with adapters. But both 20 and 24 pins are keyed and clipped, so they can only be secured one way. Just align the clipped side with the notch on the connector. Next, we have the P4 CPU 4-pin or 8-pin EPS. This connector is specifically in charge of providing power to your CPU or the socket, which will not function without it. And depending on your motherboard specification, it'll either accept a single 4-pin, a single 8-pin, an 8-pin and a 4-pin, or dual 8 pins. This is going to be a bit of a confusing point here. It's easy to understand why. So most modern boards will accept at least a single 8 pin, right? But some higher end boards have an additional 4 pin tacked beside it, or an additional 8 pin. So you could have an 8+4 or an 8+8 for CPU power. However, unless you're into some like heavy duty overclocking, connecting just the 8 pin will suffice. Basically, this cable will supply up to 155 watts, and this cable will supply up to 235. You can actually connect just a 4-pin to an 8-pin connector, by the way, though you should always try to connect the full 8 if your power supply provides it. Most affordable CPUs won't pull any more than around 150 watts on their own, but you wouldn't want to overload this single cable or risk system instability. This EVGA 550N1 splits the 8-pin EPS into 2 4-pin counterparts, which can be connected together in a motherboard CPU 8-pin header. It's also notched and keyed only one way, so mind the orientation. Next up, we have PCIe connectors. See, most decently powerful graphics cards will consume at least 100 watts of power or more under load, and the power sent to the card through the PCIe slot via the 24-pin caps out at around 75 watts. So to account for this delta, power supply vendors added supplemental PCIe power cables that look something like this. Often you'll see a cluster of 6 pins and a daisy chain of 2 pin off to the side. The pinout is relatively straightforward here as well, with the additional 2 pins merely providing grounds for the array of 12-volt leads. And accounting for this additional headroom makes sense because graphics cards with single 8 pins typically pull more power than those with single 6 pins. In some cases even, you'll find that a single 6+2 pin header is actually daisy chained to another 6+2 pin header, meaning that all supplemental graphics card power is being fed down an often lower gauge of wire to handle the increased power draw. If the power supply is designed efficiently, there's really no downside to this design. So if your graphics card requires 2 supplemental 8 pins to function, you'll want to be sure that your power supply comes equipped with them. If the card only requires a single 6 or 8 pin, you can leave any additional PCIe cables unplugged without issue. Also try to avoid adapters and splitters if possible, especially with some of those higher end cards out there. And just some friendly advice, 8-pin PCIe power cables look awfully similar to CPU 8-pin EPS cables, so be sure to identify which is which before attempting to shove something where it doesn't belong. CPU 8-pin cables will often have a split in the middle to accommodate for systems that accept only P4, but another way to reference it would be via the shape of each pin. Some are notched and some aren't, and you really shouldn't be able to force these into their opposing headers anyway, but I'd still like to point it out in case you're having difficulty getting things to slide in. Next are SATA or serial ATA power connectors. These are 15-pin cables that are intended to power various storage drives, including modern hard disk and solid-state drives outside of M.2. These connectors are also used by various fan hubs, controllers, and RGB strips. They're keyed on one side and thus can only be connected one way. And much like the other cables we've already discussed, again, leaving any number of these unplugged is perfectly fine. And lastly, we have Molex power connectors, these chunky things right here. These are a bit older, more simplified than SATA's, consisting of just like literally 4 pins, 2 grounds, and single 12-volt and 5-volt leads. Molex has taken a backseat in recent days Thankfully, the connector is far more primitive and a bit more difficult to manage at that. Still though, you'll find a few peripherals relying on Molex for discretionary power, including D5 pumps, which need the lower gauge wire for more reliable power delivery. Some older RGB strips and old fans in some cases may have Molex connectors as well. Non-modular power supplies will often include these just to be safe, because you don't want to need a Molex connector and not actually have one, and most people don't have adapters laying around. But in any case, they can often be omitted in modular units for most PC builds that would reduce clutter. And again, Molex is shaped in such a way that cables will only connect one way, so you don't really need to worry about wiring these backwards and sending 5 volts where 12 volts should be sent. And that should take care of just about every connection associated with a conventional and modern power supply. For more information on determining what wattage power supply you'll need for your build, which is another perfectly viable question a lot of people ask, check out this video here. It's also linked
Hi, one of the most popular projects in electronics, especially for beginners, is to build your own power supply, your own lab power supply, and I highly recommend it. As I've done on many occasions, you should build your own. And a good lab power supply is one that has constant voltage and constant current, as you might know. If you don't know, you do now. And how do you go about building one of those? Well, it's pretty simple. There's hundreds of designs out there using basic LM317s or whatever, you know, a voltage control knob, a current control knob for the constant current. Pretty simple, but a lot of people ask, how do you do it with software control, or at least have the capability to add software control, be it from a PIC, from an Atmel, an Arduino, or a PC, or whatever processor or intelligent thing. You may not want to use an expensive 10-turn pot, which I've recommended you should have on a good lab power supply. You may want to use an optical rotary encoder knob and hook it up to a microcontroller and then control the voltage and current that way. How do you do it? It's a good question. It's a bit more complicated than your more traditional design that just uses the knobs for the voltage and current. They're very simple designs. There's hundreds of them out there. Choose your own flavor for your own voltage and current requirements and stuff like that. But when you add that software capability, it's a bit more complex. And also, I thought I'd throw in an extra thing as a supply which goes down to 0 volts as well. So let's go through the process of designing, building, breadboarding, and testing a lab power supply that has that sort of capability. Let's go. And of course, the first thing we're going to start with are the specs, because if you don't have specs to work from, well, it's going to be a dog's breakfast. So let's have a look. We want a very modest low range supply today, just for the sake of argument, 0 to 6 volts. Now that's important. 0 volts output is not always easy to obtain in a lab supply if you're using a basic LM317, especially when we get down to the last one here. I'll go into it. Anyway, it's not as easy. A lot of power supplies, traditional ones, will only go down to 1.2 or 1.25 volts. And the reason for that is the reference voltage used in, say, an LM317 used in the design. Anyway, we'll go into that. But we want a complete from 0 to 6 volt range. We want a modest 0 to 1 amp constant current adjustment on it, because a good lab power supply's got to have constant current adjust knob on it. We want, and this is a key point, we want a optional, it's not mandatory, we can use knobs, or we can replace those knobs with a microcontroller software control of both the voltage and the constant current value, usually using a pulse width modulation scheme, because that's how you generate a voltage and voltage output easily from a microcontroller like a PIC. You use a PWM, a pulse width modulator. You can use a DAC, but most micros don't have a DAC built in, so they have pulse width modulators. And we want low noise, which basically means we're going to use a linear power supply. We're going to design a linear power supply today, not a switching one. And we want a single supply input. And you'll find, as we go through, you'll find why that's actually important, because it's harder to get a true 0 volt output range with only a single supply input. So there's our specs. Remember them. That's what we're designed around. So let's get into the design. And of course, when you're building a lab power supply like this, one of the first devices you're going to consider is the classic LM317, and you've probably seen this before in both of these configurations. It's a classic device, it's robust, it's low noise, it works, it's relatively stable, it works in constant current and constant voltage configurations, which you can cascade as we've done here. Very versatile device. And let's take a look at what how you can build a basic lab power supply with an LM317 based system. Now, we've got our voltage input here, and we've cascaded two LM317s in series. Now, what we've done is we've used the classic constant current configuration where we use a single, in this case, adjustable resistor. You'd have to use a wire wound pot in there to set your constant current, or in this case, a maximum constant current, which it won't exceed. And this formula is very simple. To calculate the maximum current is the reference voltage, 1.25 volts, as we've seen, divided by R1 up here, and that gives you your maximum constant current. And because basically very little current flows through these resistors, and it's basically in series with your load, your output here, then your output load
With the development of power semiconductor equipment, the requirements for the suppression of radio interference excited by powerful transistors and thyristors for the voltage of hundreds or thousands of volts have increased. The problem is solved by the use in the dampened circuits of these devices of film
Hey guys, what's up? Eddie Alhu here with KissAnalog.com. Alright guys, so today what I want to do is I want to cover a very specialized capacitor. It's very commonly used, but it's a very specialized capacitor. You know, I'm a power engineer, so I have to know how to use
Welcome to Summoner's Rift. "30 seconds until minions spawn.
Their gods cannot save them from me. I left the
Minions have spawned.
hospitality behind. You will be far more useful in death. I forge nightfall from mortal.
First blood.
I march toward endless glory. Weaklings cower in the light. I eternal darkness.
An enemy has been slain.
You are already doomed. Our speakings the slaughter.
You have been slain.
Another joins the energy pool.
Death cannot hold me.
An ally has been slain. Shut down.
The din of the living world, the silence of the hereafter. I rule it all.
An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
I promise eternity.
You have been slain.
ungrateful call me tyrant. The wise call me lord.
An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain. Shut down.
Malice never wanes.
An enemy has been slain. Enemy has been slain.
My will is once again bound to iron.
An enemy has been slain. An enemy has been slain. Killing spree.
I suffered a mortal body. Now I am iron incarnate. Face mortality.
Rampage.
Shed the frailty of flesh.
Killing spree.
Fate sealed.
Rampage.
Lives are temporary. I stand eternal.
You have been slain. An enemy has been slain.
Death cannot hold me. All souls are forfeit.
Unstoppable. Double kill. Dominating.
Your demise.
Unstoppable. Double kill. Godlike. Your team has destroyed a turret. Godlike. Double kill. An ally has been slain. You have been slain.
Unfettered by mortality.
Your team has destroyed a turret. An ally has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
Only the worthy receive the gift of Nightfall's kiss.
Legendary. Legendary. Double kill. Legendary. Double kill. Your team has destroyed a turret. Your team has destroyed a turret. spree. Your team has destroyed a turret.
My will is once again bound to iron.
Legendary.
The dead belong to me. The living shall be next.
Your team has destroyed a turret. Killing spree. Double kill. Triple kill. Legendary. Your team has destroyed an inhibitor. Your team has destroyed a turret. Dominating. Legendary. Legendary. Double kill. Aced. Your team has destroyed a turret. Victory!
My heart and sword, always for Demacia.